The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Dr. James Turner sat hunched over his computer, his fingers tapping away at the keyboard. Data flashed across the screen, columns of numbers and graphs charting the results of weeks of trials. Outside, the glass walls of the lab reflected the cold, clinical sterility of his world, steel tables, microscopes, and the faint odor of antiseptic hanging in the air. It wasn't supposed to be this way. They'd promised him this would be the breakthrough of the century, a drug designed to push the boundaries of human evolution itself. Project Apex, they'd called it. A cocktail of modified proteins and retrograde DNA designed to awaken dormant genes buried deep within the human genome. The result? Superhuman abilities, enhanced strength, sharper senses, and cognitive function far beyond anything modern man could imagine. They were playing with ancient fire, unlocking something primal. But something was wrong. James stared at the latest test results, a creeping unease gnawing at the back of his mind. The first round of human trials had gone off without a hitch. Subjects reported feeling stronger, faster, more alert. But then there was Marcus, the star athlete turned war veteran, whose body had reacted faster than anyone else's. Marcus had excelled in every test, outperforming even the most optimistic projections, until today. Today, Marcus had changed. James rubbed his temples, trying to shake the tension that had settled like a weight on his chest. It had started small, a strange gleam in Marcus's eyes, a twitch in his fingers that seemed almost predatory. But then it escalated. An hour ago, Marcus had been restrained after attacking one of the lab assistants. No one saw it coming. One moment, Marcus was sitting calmly in his observation room. The next, he was snarling, teeth bared, eyes wild. James replayed the footage in his mind, over and over. The sound of growling, not human, but something else, something deep and feral, reverberated through the lab. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitating. If he logged this incident in the system, it would raise red flags. They'd shut down the project, and years of research would be lost. More than that, his reputation would be in ruins. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. He needed to see Marcus, needed to confirm what his instincts were screaming at him. The sterile white halls of the lab stretched endlessly before him as he made his way to the containment area. His heart thudded in his chest, the rhythmic pounding an echo of his mounting anxiety. As he reached Marcus's room, he hesitated, his hand resting on the cool metal handle. A voice crackled over the intercom. "Dr. Turner, you shouldn't." But James was already inside. The observation room was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from the narrow slit of a window high on the far wall. The room smelled of sweat, blood, and something metallic. Marcus was sitting in the corner, his back to the door, his breath coming in heavy, ragged gasps. His skin, once tanned and healthy, now seemed stretched, pale, almost translucent under the harsh light. Muscles twitched unnaturally beneath his skin, as if something inside him was trying to break free. "Marcus," James called softly, trying to mask the fear in his voice. Marcus didn't respond. Instead, his head jerked slightly, a strange cracking sound emanating from his neck. Slowly, too slowly, he turned toward James. James's breath caught in his throat. Marcus's eyes were no longer human. They glowed faintly, almost like an animal's in the dark, yellow, with pinprick pupils that darted around the room before focusing directly on James. His lips curled back, revealing sharp teeth that had not been there this morning. "Get out," Marcus whispered, his voice low, guttural. It wasn't a plea. It was a warning. James took an involuntary step back, his hand fumbling for the door handle, but Marcus was already moving. In a blur of motion, he lunged forward, slamming into the glass, separating them with bone-shaking force. The glass held, but just barely. Spiderweb cracks splintered across the surface. "Get out," Marcus roared, slamming his fists against the glass again. His nails, no claws, scratched deep grooves into the reinforced barrier. James stumbled out of the room, heart racing, sweat beading on his forehead. He slammed the door shut and backed away, eyes wide with disbelief. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he'd just witnessed. This wasn't regression. This was something else. Something ancient and dangerous had awakened inside Marcus. Behind the glass, Marcus's breathing grew louder, more animalistic, as he paced back and forth like a caged predator. The cracks in the glass deepened with every blow. James backed away, heart pounding in his chest. The intercom crackled again. "Dr. Turner, he's changing." James didn't need to be told twice. He turned and ran, the echoes of Marcus's growls chasing him down the hallway. He had to stop this, before it spread beyond the lab. before the world discovered that apex predators weren't extinct after all. They were just waiting to be unleashed. James couldn't sleep. The fluorescent hum that had once been the familiar backdrop of his life now felt oppressive, like an endless buzz gnawing at his mind. His thoughts spun in tight circles, always coming back to Marcus. The crackling growls, the animalistic glare of those yellow eyes. Marcus had become something else, something not human. But more terrifying than the change itself was the deeper truth gnawing at him. This wasn't an accident. The next morning, James returned to his lab in a daze, his mind still clutching the edges of what he had seen, as though it could unravel if he let go. Everything felt different now. The lab, once a place of sterile precision, seemed suffused with a malign presence. The walls seemed closer, the light more dim. Even the air tasted different, heavy, thick, like standing in the eye of some great and unseen storm. A few of his colleagues passed him in the hallway, offering nervous smiles, but James barely registered them. They hadn't seen what he'd seen. They couldn't know the creeping horror that had been set loose in the depths of this building. He was alone with this knowledge. Sitting at his desk, he pulled up the files on Project Apex. The data scrolled past in a blur of numbers and clinical terminology, but none of it felt right anymore. There were gaps in the reports, sections redacted or omitted altogether, like missing pieces of a puzzle no one wanted to complete. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He knew he had to dig deeper, to understand what they had truly unlocked with the drug. He bypassed the security protocols, accessing the restricted files buried beneath layers of encryption. As the files decrypted, the air in the room seemed to thicken, and a low pressure settled over him, like the weight of unseen eyes watching from the shadows. There it was, the original research. It wasn't just about enhancing humans. It was about regression, pushing the genome back to a time before civilization, before the shackles of human reason. The drug targeted deep, forgotten parts of human DNA, genes that hadn't been active for millions of years. These genes were not human, not fully. They were something older, something primal and alien to the modern world. The drug had awakened them, and Marcus was merely the beginning. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then, a long, low hum reverberated through the lab, like the drone of some far-off, colossal engine grinding beneath the surface of reality. James stood up sharply, his skin prickling with the sense that something was terribly wrong. He could feel it now, something ancient stirring at the edges of his perception, a presence vast and indifferent, lingering just beyond his comprehension. The door to the lab creaked open, and Dr. Morris entered, his face pale and drawn. "James, we've lost another subject." James turned slowly, his stomach nodding. "What do you mean lost?" "They're gone," Morris whispered, his voice shaking, just like Marcus. But this one didn't escape. There was nothing left of him, he trailed off, as though the words themselves refused to form, just pieces. James's mind raced. The creatures weren't just changing, they were evolving. Faster than anyone could have predicted, faster than anyone could understand. Whatever they were becoming, it wasn't something the human mind could fully grasp. It was like staring into the black abyss of the unknown, something vast, unknowable, and utterly indifferent to human existence. As they left the lab and walked down the corridor, the air grew colder, the lights flickering sporadically as if they, too, sensed the encroaching dread. Every shadow seemed to ripple, stretching and shifting like living things moving just out of sight. When they reached the observation room, the door was already ajar. The sound of low, guttural breathing echoed from within. James felt his blood freeze as he stepped inside. The room was dark, save for the dim glow of the security monitors. In the center of the room was the subject, or what was left of him. His body was twisted and contorted, as if every muscle had been stretched beyond the breaking point. His skin had taken on a translucent hue, revealing the dark, pulsating veins beneath, a network of something organic but utterly inhuman. His eyes were open, wide and staring, but there was nothing left behind them. The same yellow glow that had flickered in Marcus's eyes was here, but worse, far worse. It was as though something from another world was gazing out through those vacant orbs, something impossibly ancient and malevolent. The air grew thick with the stench of blood, and something else, something metallic and unidentifiable. "They aren't human anymore," Morris said, his voice barely audible over the rhythmic hum. "They're reverting, evolving into something primal, something predatory." James's hands shook as he backed away from the twisted figure. The sheer enormity of what they had unleashed clawed at his mind. This was no mere mutation. The drug had awakened a force far older than humanity itself, something cosmic, beyond human comprehension. These creatures weren't just reverting to a prehistoric state. They were becoming something else, something from the deep recesses of time, from an era when man was not the dominant force in the universe. The realization hit him with the weight of an impending catastrophe. They had stirred something that should have been left alone. The lights flickered again, casting long, grotesque shadows over the mutated figure on the floor. The hum grew louder, almost deafening now, as if the very fabric of the lab was unraveling. James felt the presence again, closer this time, pressing in on all sides, warping the space around them. It was as if reality itself was beginning to bend under the weight of this thing that had been summoned. James turned to Morris, his voice trembling. "We have to stop this. We have to end it before it spreads." Morris's eyes were wide with fear, his face pale as a ghost. "It's too late," he whispered. "We've opened the door, and whatever's on the other side, it's already here." As they left the room, James couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Something vast and eternal, lingering just beyond the reach of his senses. The shadows seemed to writhe and twist as they walked down the hall, as though they were not alone in the building anymore. The drug hadn't just awakened primal genes. It had awakened something else. Something far older than humanity, older than Earth itself. And it was hungry. The darkness outside the facility was suffocating, a thick blanket that seemed to smother the world beyond the walls. The lights from the building flickered intermittently, casting brief glimpses of the forest beyond, gnarled trees and twisted branches, like the skeletal fingers of some ancient, slumbering giant. Inside, the atmosphere was no less oppressive. James stood at the main console, staring at the security monitors. The images flickered with static, showing the perimeter of the facility in grainy black and white. But what caught his attention wasn't the failing technology. It was the growing absence of life. The forest was silent now, unnaturally so. No birds called out, no wind rustled through the leaves. It was as though the land itself had drawn in a breath and was holding it, waiting for something unspeakable to emerge. "We've lost all external communication," one of the technicians muttered, his voice strained with barely contained panic. "No signal from any of the emergency teams. We're on our own." James barely registered the words. His mind was consumed by the image of Marcus, by the twisted remains of the latest subject, and by the gnawing, relentless sense that something had shifted irrevocably. The drug hadn't just unleashed ancient predatory instincts. It had unlocked a door, one that led to a place beyond understanding, a place where reason and nature bowed before the unfathomable. "They're out there," James whispered, his voice hollow, "and they're waiting." He turned to the small group gathered behind him, scientists, technicians, a few security guards. Their faces were pale, drawn tight with fear. They hadn't seen what he hadn't peered into the eyes of the predators lurking just beyond the flickering lights, but they felt it. The oppressive weight, the sense that something vast and incomprehensible was now circling them, like sharks in deep water. "They're not just animals," James continued, his voice low but urgent. "They're something else. They're evolving. We're not dealing with the remnants of some ancient predator. We're dealing with something older, something outside of time." The others stared at him, their eyes wide with disbelief, but no one spoke. How could they? What words could capture the scale of what was happening, of the horror creeping through their lives, distorting the boundaries of reality itself? Suddenly, the lights flickered again, and the low, droning hum that had been a distant presence grew louder. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing down on them with a suffocating force. The security monitors blinked out, replaced by an impenetrable wall of static. "They're here," James said, his voice barely audible over the mounting dread. Then the power went out completely. The darkness that followed was more than the absence of light. It was a presence in itself, vast and enveloping, as though they had been plunged into the belly of some great and unseen beast. The air felt colder, thick with the weight of the unknown. The hum, that terrible hum, grew louder still, vibrating through the walls, through their bones, like the sound of a distant, cosmic engine grinding against the fabric of reality. A sound pierced the air, low, guttural, and impossibly deep. It wasn't human. It wasn't even animal. It was something else, something from the far reaches of the universe, where stars collapsed into themselves and time bent in ways the human mind could never fathom. "We need to move," James said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "They're hunting." He led the group through the facility, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. The hallway stretched before them like the gaping maw of some ancient tunnel, the shadows shifting unnaturally along the walls. As they passed the observation rooms, James felt a chill crawl down his spine. The glass walls were splintered, the thick panes webbed with cracks where the creatures had slammed against them in their escape. The thought haunted him. These weren't merely physical beings anymore. They had slipped beyond the constraints of flesh and bone. Whatever the drug had awakened, it was something far older, something that existed in the spaces between the stars, in the void beyond human comprehension. A low growl echoed through the hallway, vibrating the very air around them. James froze, his breath catching in his throat. The others huddled together, their eyes wide with terror, staring into the inky blackness ahead. Then they saw it. A shape emerged from the darkness, moving with unnatural fluidity. It was tall, too tall, its limbs elongated and sinewy, its skin glistening under the faint emergency lights that flickered weakly. Its eyes, those terrible, glowing eyes, pierced the darkness, filled with a hunger that transcended mere physical need. This was not an animal. This was not even a predator in the traditional sense. This was something far worse. The creature moved with deliberate slowness, as if savoring the fear that radiated from the group. Its head tilted slightly, those yellow eyes narrowing, and for a moment James felt as though it was studying them, testing them. But it was the way the shadows seemed to warp and bend around it that truly sent a shiver through his soul. The creature didn't just exist in the physical world. It extended into something else, something beyond the tangible. The very air around it seemed to ripple and distort, as if the boundaries of reality itself were struggling to contain its presence. Without warning, the creature lunged. Chaos erupted as the group scattered, running in every direction. The thing moved impossibly fast, a blur of movement that defied the laws of nature, of physics. James heard screams, short, abrupt, cut off as quickly as they began. He ran, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. This wasn't just a mutation. This wasn't just an accident of science. They had tapped into something far deeper, something cosmic in scale. As he sprinted through the hallways, the hum of that unseen presence grew louder, almost deafening now. It wasn't just in the walls. It was in his mind, in his blood, in every cell of his body. He could feel it, something vast and ancient pressing in from all sides, warping the very space around them. And then, as he reached the far end of the facility, he saw it. A tear in the air itself, a jagged, pulsing rift that seemed to throb with an energy he couldn't begin to comprehend. It was like looking into the eye of infinity, endless and different and beyond human understanding. The creatures hadn't come from the drug. The drug had merely opened the door. The predators weren't just hunting. They were here to consume. And the world was their prey. The cold air clawed at James's skin as he stumbled through the darkened corridors of the facility, his heart pounding in his chest. His breath came in ragged gasps, each inhalation thick with the coppery scent of blood and something else, something he could not name but felt in his very marrow. It clung to the air, to the walls, and to his thoughts like a parasite feeding off his growing fear. Behind him, the facility was unraveling. The sound of shattering glass, of bodies falling, of screams abruptly cut off. It all blended into a cacophony that barely seemed real anymore. But the worst sound of all was the hum, that low, vibrating drone that pulsed through the very fabric of the world around him. It was more than sound. It was a presence, an invisible force pressing in from all sides, warping reality itself. He could feel it now, deep in his bones, a pressure, an ancient awareness watching them, watching him. The creatures weren't simply predators. They were avatars of something beyond human comprehension, manifestations of a vast cosmic will, something that had waited in the dark spaces between stars, in the infinite blackness of the void for eons. And now, that force had found a way through them, through the drug. James reached a junction in the hallways and paused, struggling to catch his breath. He had no sense of direction anymore. The layout of the building was shifting, changing, as though the walls themselves were no longer bound by the laws of space. Doorways twisted into angles that hurt his eyes, corridors stretched longer than they should, and shadows seemed to move on their own, rippling like liquid under some unseen gravity. He had to keep moving. But as he turned to continue down the hall, a figure stepped out from the darkness. Marcus. Or what used to be Marcus. His form was barely recognizable, his limbs elongated, his skin pale and stretched thin over grotesquely reshaped muscles. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, that same animalistic yellow gleam James had seen before. Only now, there was something more, a depth, a terrible vastness behind those eyes, as though they were no longer windows into a single mind, but rather a conduit for something far larger, something that watched through Marcus from a place outside time itself. James, Marcus rasped, his voice warped, guttural and hollow, as though coming from some immense distance. It's already too late. James backed away, his mouth dry, his legs trembling. He wanted to run, but his body refused to move. It was as if Marcus knew. The thing inside Marcus held him in place with just a look. "What have you become?" James whispered, the words barely escaping his lips. Marcus tilted his head, his neck cracking audibly, and for a moment, something almost resembling a smile twisted his elongated features. "I have become what I was always meant to be. What we were always meant to be." James's pulse quickened. "We? You're talking about the drug. It's changed you, mutated you into this." "No," Marcus replied, stepping closer, the shadows around him warping and twisting as he moved. "The drug didn't change us. It revealed us. It stripped away the illusion of what we thought we were and brought us back to what we truly are." "What we truly are," James's voice trembled. "This isn't evolution. This is something else, something unnatural." "Unnatural," Marcus laughed, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated the walls. "Nothing could be more natural. We are part of the greater design, James, part of the real universe, the one that lies beneath the thin layer of reality we cling to. You don't understand because you still think in human terms, but soon you'll see." James felt the world around him shifting, the walls melting into shadows, the floor rippling like liquid under his feet. It was as though the laws of nature had begun to break down, yielding to something older, something that had existed long before the earth had formed. He fought to hold on to his sanity, to keep his mind from unraveling in the face of the incomprehensible vastness pressing in on him. "You can fight it," James said, his voice shaking. "You don't have to give in to it." Marcus's yellow eyes gleamed. "You still think you have a choice? You don't. None of us do. The door is open now, and what waits on the other side, it's already here." The hum grew louder, filling the air with an oppressive, mind-numbing vibration. James pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block it out, but it was inside his head now, crawling through his thoughts like a parasite burrowing into his brain. He could feel it, the presence, the thing that Marcus had become a part of, reaching out for him, pulling him toward the abyss. But then, something broke through the haze. A memory. A flash of clarity. He wasn't just a scientist. He had a mind, a will of his own. He wasn't going to let this thing take him. Summoning every ounce of strength, James turned and ran. He sprinted down the corridor, his feet pounding against the floor, the world twisting and distorting around him. The hum pursued him, growing louder with every step, but he pushed it out of his mind. He couldn't think about what it was or what it meant. All that mattered now was survival. He burst through a set of heavy doors and found himself in one of the upper levels of the facility. The walls here were less warped, the reality more stable, at least for now. His lungs burned, his legs ached, but he couldn't stop. He had to find a way out, a way to escape this nightmare before it consumed him completely. But deep down, he knew the truth. There was no escaping this. Not really. The thing they had unleashed wasn't confined to the facility. It was everywhere, in the very fabric of existence, stretching its influence into the deepest corners of reality. There was no hiding from it. Still, he had to try. As he approached the exit, James felt the hum fade slightly, retreating into the background. The pressure in his skull eased, and for a brief, fleeting moment, he allowed himself to believe he might actually make it out alive. But as he reached for the door, he froze. Outside, the world was no longer the same. The sky had darkened to a sickly green, and the trees bent at unnatural angles, as though twisted by some unseen force. The air shimmered with the same rippling distortion he had seen in the facility, like the very fabric of reality was unraveling. And standing in the distance, emerging from the twisted horizon, were figures. Dozens of them. Not human. Not anymore. They were waiting. Waiting for him. The sky churned like a living thing, a swirling vortex of green-black clouds twisting above James as he stood on the edge of the world. The horizon was no longer a line separating earth from sky. It had dissolved into a nightmare of writhing shapes and impossible angles, where reality bled into something far more ancient, far more indifferent. His breath came in shallow gasps, his heart pounding not from exertion, but from the sheer weight of what lay before him. There were no longer boundaries between what was real and what was not. The air hummed with a low, resonant frequency, vibrating the very cells in his body. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a pulse, a signal from something far beyond the universe he had known. James felt it in his blood, in his bones. He could feel them too, moving just at the edges of his vision. Not human. No, that part of them had been stripped away. They were the product of an evolution far older than anything recorded in the fossil record. Something not bound by the constraints of time or biology. They were part of the vastness that had been awakened, ancient agents of a cosmic order that predated not just mankind, but the stars themselves. The figures moved toward him with a terrifying grace, their bodies twisted in ways that defied the natural order. Long limbs, elongated torsos, skin that shimmered in the dying light, as though it wasn't entirely solid. Their eyes, those glowing yellow eyes, burned with a cold intelligence, but behind that, James sensed something else, something that had never been human. For a moment, James considered running. But to where? The world was already unraveling. The sky above him was not a sky but a window into the vast, incomprehensible void beyond. And in that void he sensed them watching, beings whose scale and scope eclipsed anything his fragile mind could grasp. They were the true predators, and what walked the earth now were their emissaries. "You cannot escape what you've become," a voice seemed to whisper in his mind, though no mouth had spoken the words. It was Marcus's voice, but it was no longer his. It had taken on that same cold, detached resonance that echoed with something other. James had seen enough to know there was no place left to hide. The creatures, what had once been his colleagues, his subjects, were not just physical beings. They were conduits, vessels for something far greater. The mutations were not random. They were a precise design, a reshaping of flesh to reflect a more ancient and efficient order. He felt his own body betraying him. His senses had sharpened to a painful degree. He could hear every whisper of wind, every shift of the earth beneath his feet. His skin tingled, stretched taut, as if something inside was pressing outward, demanding to be released. But it wasn't just physical. His mind, too, was warping. The reality he had known for all his life, laws of nature, of physics, of cause and effect, felt distant now, like faded memories. The world was a lie. A thin veneer stretched over the true face of existence, and that face was staring back at him now, vast and uncaring. The figures stopped a few feet from him, their twisted forms haloed by the unnatural light. They did not speak, not with mouths, but he heard them all the same, heard their thoughts pressing into his mind, filling the empty spaces with terrible knowledge. "Join us," the voice said, and James realized it was not a command. It was an invitation. The choice was his. For a moment, James considered resisting. He considered fighting, clawing his way back to the fragile thread of humanity that still lingered within him. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew it was futile. There was no fight left. The force that had been awakened, the ancient cosmic will that had reasserted itself through them, was too vast, too old to be opposed. And more than that, there was a pull, a gravitational force that reached deep into his soul, drawing him towards something not wholly understood, yet strangely familiar. He had been born of this universe, after all. This force, this vast, indifferent order, it was in his DNA, in the atoms that made up his flesh. We were always meant to be this. The creatures, his new kin, waited, their glowing eyes fixed on him, not in hunger, but in understanding. They had already made the transition. They had accepted their role in this great cosmic tapestry, and now they waited for him to do the same. James closed his eyes and let the pull take him. The transformation was not painful, at least not in the physical sense. It was a peeling away, layer by layer, of what he had thought was his identity. His memories, his fears, his attachments, they were stripped from him, blown away like dust in the wind. What was left was pure, simple. Predator. There. He opened his eyes, and the world was different, sharper, clearer. He could see the lines of reality bending, shifting. The creatures in front of him were no longer grotesque. They were beautiful in their simplicity, in their efficiency. They moved with a grace that was not bound by the rules of biology, but by something far deeper, something written into the very fabric of existence. The hum was gone now, replaced by a deep silence, the kind that existed at the center of the universe, where time and space collapsed into a single point. James breathed in, and for the first time he truly understood. The universe was not a chaotic, indifferent place. It was a carefully constructed system, a design of unimaginable complexity, and he was part of it now. He had become the apex predator. Around him the world continued to dissolve, the last remnants of the old order crumbling into the void, but it no longer mattered. What lay beyond was not darkness, not chaos. It was order. a vast, incomprehensible order beyond good and evil, beyond life and death. The creatures turned and began to move into the wilderness, their forms blending into the shifting landscape. James followed, his movements now fluid, effortless. He was no longer bound by the limitations of his former self. He was part of something greater. As they disappeared into the void that had once been the horizon, James felt nothing but a deep, resonant peace. The hunt was eternal, and he was finally where he belonged,